What's up, friends? I am flying out today to interview Reverend Otis Moss III in Chicago. Now, depending on where you grew up in the evangelical tradition or Catholic tradition, you either know who Reverend Otis Moss III is or you have no idea. His dad marched with MLK Jr., and Reverend Otis Moss III is one of the most influential Black pastors in America doing great work for civil rights. Now, the reason why we're dropping this episode today is because January 20th is the inauguration of Donald Trump and also MLK Day. I thought to myself, what a powerful juxtaposition of what MLK calls is the two different Americas. So I wanted to talk to Reverend Otis Moss III and get his take from a perspective that I never grew up hearing, or if I did hear about it, was always denigrated as being liberal or Marxist or not really a true Christian perspective. So first we have to get to Chicago, survive the cold, and then I hope you enjoy this conversation. Talk to you soon. Oh, yeah, let's go. I do love the gold of this elevator. Reminds me of Trump Tower. We're in sunny Chicago, where it's a blistering 19 degrees Fahrenheit, which even for me living on the East Coast is cold. But yeah, we're on the way to interview Reverend Otis Moss III, and I'm pumped to do it. One of the challenges of doing interviews in general for me is I'm not someone who does a lot of show prep, because what makes conversations compelling and feel natural is when you're having a real conversation. The challenge with Reverend Otis Moss is that there's so much history here. He's one of the most influential pastors in the Black church. His father marched with MLK. Where do you even start? And we're dropping this episode on January 20th, which is when the inauguration of Trump happens and also coincides with MLK Day. So there's just so many layers to unpack. So we'll see how it goes. I'm pumped to talk to him. We're going to do it in his church, which has so much history. President Obama attended this church. And to have that conversation with Reverend Otis Moss about MLK and his legacy and the legacy that he was a part of compared to Trump's legacy and how those two things coincide, how they really paint two different versions of America. There's a lot to unpack, and we're going to do that. So we'll see how it goes.
We have always looked at and seen the contradiction. That, the idea of serving and connecting with God from below is very different than from above. And the Black church tradition has had this liberation tradition that critiques Western Christianity and Western culture, and revels also in the celebration of the unique cultural narrative that the Black people come out of. Jim Wallace said, we had a conversation some time ago, it was really quite funny. Jim Wallace was talking about the challenge that, is it possible to be white and Christian? And he was saying no. He said, I can be Scottish and Christian, but I can't be white and Christian because my ethnicity gives a story.
Yeah.
My ethnicity gives a tradition. My ethnicity has food, but whiteness is this construction that does not have a tradition. So when someone is Irish, there's a beautiful thing. We went to a jazz festival in the Netherlands, and we spent some time in Ireland, and it was just so wonderful spending time in Ireland because of understanding colonialism as being Irish. Second, the deep ties that the Irish community has with South Africa and other spaces, because we know what colonization is like through the British Empire. So if you all are anti-British, we're with you all day long. Yeah. And Frederick Douglass, when he had to leave the United States, one because of the raid at Harper's Ferry, John Brown's raid. John Brown and his family had talked about Frederick Douglass, joining us. He's like, look, I'm Black. I'll be treated differently in reference to this. And his family was so deeply angry that they implicated him in Harper's Ferry. And he had nothing to do with it. So he had to leave the U.S. Where does he go? He goes to the United Kingdom, but specifically Ireland. And he is greeted as this hero. So you go to Ireland today, there are, in Ireland and Scotland, interestingly enough, there are murals of Frederick Douglass that the Irish people like, oh yeah, we understand his style of faith. He speaks to us. And so he was going through Ireland and Scotland and other places, attracting crowds of 10,000 people.
Wow.
This is at the turn of the century.
Wow.
You know, this is unbelievable. Well, it was not the turn of the century. That was about 1850, 57, 58. He was in there around that time period. I don't have the exact time, but there's a great book that was recently done on Frederick Douglass as an American prophet, and deals with his faith tradition and how the world viewed him, but America could not see him in that manner, and how his faith tradition, he was real clear. I practice a form of faith that America is yet to practice. They don't know anything about this because you cannot love Jesus and hold someone in bondage. And I think that's what we're still struggling with today is the bifurcation, the separation, the siloing of Sunday worship and midweek or during the week colonization.
What you said and what you said about Jim Wallace, about, you can't be white and be a Christian, talking about the whiteness piece, really resonates strongly. And I think it's really important to flesh out for a minute because one of the things I've realized as I'm going down my own process of trying to decolonize, and I'm still early on, still trying to learn new voices, new ways of thinking, is that I realized that one of the problems of whiteness, there's many, but one of them is that you're right. I'm part Italian, Greek, and German.
Come on.
And I know nothing besides eting meatballs and spaghetti and meatballs and maybe, eating certain types of food a little bit or watching the movie 300 about the the Greeks back in the day. But I really, I'm not tied to those cultures at all. I don't see myself as German. I'm just a white man in America, right? It totally erases any kind of ancestral ties to any of those ethnicities I'm a part of.
Right.
And it really untethers me from a deeper tradition. And it's just, you don't realize it until people start kind of pointing out that, no, Tim, this is also a problem for you. It's not just about whiteness being toxic for other people who don't look like you, which is totally true. But you as a white man also don't have a place to call home. You don't have a tradition that you can draw from, and learn from as well. And I think that's really important because you're right. And when the way Jim says that is actually brilliant. What whiteness represents in America is conquer and colonization and taking over and power and control. And you just read the Beatitudes.
Right.
And you're automatically at odds with that power structure. What is fascinating is, as someone who grew up in that world, how you just don't see it. All the theology, the hermeneutics, the way you're taught to interpret the Bible, political situations are all through a different lens that convince you that being faithful to Jesus is embracing this, we have to be in charge and people have to be beneath us to bring God's blessing back to America. And it's completely twisted when you think about it.
It's similar to the beautiful metaphor of there's a dining room table that's long, or there's a round table where no one is at the head. And when we delve into our ethnicity to know that we're different but not deficient, all of a sudden something beautiful comes about. So here you have Greek and Italian heritage. Yeah. So the Greek Orthodox side is very different than the Italian side. But then both sides were not considered to be white at some point.
Right.
And both sides were rejected as being other than, that here is a group that functions in a way that is dangerous to the idea of empire. And I think it's really important for people to re-engage their ethnicity, and their ethnicity in connection with their theology. That when those two things are connected, something just powerful and beautiful happens in the process.
Yeah.
So for Black people who were denied ethnicity on one level, but yet the faith tradition always kept our Africanity present. So one of the great repositories of African faith traditions rests within the Black church. And one of the beautiful aspects that the Black theological imagination brings to the table that critiques the Western tradition is the idea that there is no separation between sacred and secular. And that was the critique when you would hear Black people singing in the antebellum period. It would say, everybody talking about heaven is not going there. It was a critique saying, we have seen how you function, and the faith that you're talking about is not our faith. And there was always a double entendre in reference to the way that Black people saw the faith tradition. And that double entendre allowed us to read the Bible differently. So, for example, people hear Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and they think, oh, nice song. Right. In actuality, it's a song talking about, it's a freedom song that we're going to leave this plantation. And how you sing it, if I sing it with a bass, you need to go south. And then you do remixes, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, and then you start singing Wade in the Water as you're singing Sweet Low, Sweet Chariot. But the Wade in the Water is a signal to someone to say, make sure you go by the water so that you can get the sin off of you if you want to go north. And then you add Roll, Jordan, Roll, which says essentially follow the Mississippi, but Roll, Jordan, Roll also is talking about the fact that there is a physical heaven on earth. Where is that? Anywhere where slavery is not present. And then there is the physical place that we're from, Africa. And then there is this eschatological idea of heaven. All that wrapped up with some folks who are just singing a song. And if you don't know the double entendre, it goes right over your head, but it allows you to read the Bible differently. So when I read the Bible, for example, when Jesus says, hey, I'm going to make you fishers of men, most people spiritualize it. Well, the Black imagination is like, oh, wait a minute. Jesus is a colonized brother. Jesus is a minority. Jesus is dealing with powers that want to marginalize him and his people. So if he tells some guys to put down your nets and become fishers of men, he's telling some people who are fishing in a sea that Caesar thinks he owns. He puts those nets down, then all of a sudden, you will notice over time, if people are putting down their nets, that the money that was coming into the coffers for the empire is shrinking. Because if you fish and you get 10 fish, the tax collector comes by and says, give me 5, and I'm gonna take an extra 2 for myself. And all of a sudden, you start seeing this decay of the royal treasury, of Herod's treasury, of the empire's treasury as this client kingdom that is operating. And so there is this undergirding subversive nature, but we normally read it just as a spiritualized, just follow Jesus.
Totally.
Not realizing he's saying that no longer will you fish for someone who thinks he has power. And in the process, I'm going to undermine the economic nature of what keeps this person in power simply by non-violently you putting down your net. And then the structure of that text, which is so beautiful, he starts out with some brothers who are straight up from the hood who just got some nets. They don't even have a boat. And then the next folk, he's got these bougie guys who have trust funds. They have these servants and all of this. But both of them So he starts with the marginalized first, and then there's something happens with those who have means, and both of them follow Jesus, and a revolution ensues, and conversation then begins. What are we going to do with this guy?
Right.
Because he's upending a system, connecting them with God, but at the same time disrupting a system.
Right.
It's not either or.
Right.
It's both and.
Yeah, well, I can safely tell you that after growing up in the white church for 35 years, I've never heard that before. So, and I like to think I'm pretty widely read in those spaces, and I've heard a lot of sermons in my day. Never heard it like that, but I love that, and it makes sense. Like once you explain, I'm like, oh, I can totally see that now.
Yeah.
But until you said that, because you're right, that section of the text was always taught to me as, look, give your heart to Jesus and convert to Christianity, and become a disciple. Not in the sense of how are we impact. Well, I take it back. Not in the sense of what you just said, but more of like a spiritual means. But there is a loaded pill in that of a certain political ideology that you have to kind of assimilate into that only true Christians believe, right? And I think that's what is. For a lot of us who, the term we use is deconstructing, right? We're deconstructing our faith or whatever it is. A lot of us who started doing that realized, like, wait a second, I thought I was just here to follow Jesus, albeit totally metaphorical and not grounded enough at all. But then we found out it was loaded with like this very right-wing political ideology that, again, seemed to contradict. I'm not a Bible literalist, biblical literalist, but, welcome the foreigner, welcome the immigrant. Deport the immigrant. I'm like, guys, I'm no scholar here, but I don't think Jesus would be like holding mass deportation now signs at a Trump rally. Right. And so that was the beginning for me and for a lot of people going, again, something is wrong. So I want to ask you a question because you're the senior pastor of Trinity United Church of Christ. We're in your office. The church has so much history. It's beautiful. The stained glass windows. I was here last year, which, by the way, I got a small bone to pick with you about my time here last year, which I'm going to get into in a second. But I was here and it was just gorgeous. President Obama attended here. I mean, there's so much history. And I want your honest reaction because your father marched with MLK Jr. I mean, there's serious ties here to the Black tradition, and the civil rights movement. Does it really make you laugh very hard when I tell you that in my church tradition, I really was taught that MLK solved racism? Like literally, he solved racism. Don't judge people by the color of their skin. Problem solved. We fixed that. We'll make sure we do a nice post on MLK Day. That's it. Like racism is no longer a systemic issue. How hard do you laugh when someone like me tells you that?
I've heard it so many times, so it's just like this, here we go again. I mean, every time that I do King Day celebrations, commemorations, I usually begin with, there's a portion of a poem by Wendell Holmes that is in a book written by Vincent Harding, who is actually an editor for Dr. King's messages. He actually edited the message, A Time to Break the Silence. And he was a professor of mine when I was at University of Denver, was also a colleague of my father, just a brilliant historian who believed that you cannot understand the freedom movement without understanding the spirit. He was very clear about that. It's spirit and struggle go hand in hand. But I'm trying to get the poem right. I always begin, and it says, Wendell Holmes says about Dr. King, now that he is safely dead, let us build monuments to his name. For dead men make such convenient heroes. And we love the domesticated and dead king versus the radical king, because it requires nothing of us. That's why we like a domesticated Jesus, because it requires nothing of us. That's why we like selective texts from prophets. It requires nothing of us. We can celebrate instead of interrogating, instead of deconstructing, instead of saying, how do we create a yet-to-be United States of America, instead of making a claim that this is the greatest country ever, and it's so very perfect, and we connect our faith to a false patriotism that doesn't have any type of critique whatsoever. And so you hear that often. You hear that often. The content of our character is, people love to pick and choose little pieces. Yeah. But here you have Dr. King was killed, assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, specifically marching with sanitation workers who were killed because of the working conditions. They were not allowed to, one man was killed as a result of a garbage truck. Literally, he's a sanitation worker, but he couldn't be in the garbage truck.
Right.
It's out there, raining and everything else. And the working conditions were so poor.
He was crushed to death, right?
Yes. Yes. And you have this movement, this workers' movement that's happening. And Dr. King is saying that I want to begin a poor people's campaign that will bring together people who are Latino, who are poor and white, who are indigenous, and let's go to Washington so that we can demand a restructuring of this nation. When he died, he was considered to be the most hated man in America.
Right.
The Atlanta Journal-Constitution said that he was one of the most hated men in America. Yep. The FBI report from the COINTELPRO papers when they were released said he was the most dangerous man in America because of the influence that he had and because of his perspective. He refused to endorse capitalism, and he at the same time refused to, without critique, to embrace communism. He says that there is problems of being an individualist, and there is a problem of being collective without recognizing the individual's creativity. So he's critiquing all political spaces at the same time, and he's critiquing the church most often. The letter from a Birmingham jail is one of the most extraordinary documents in American history.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. The white moderate problem.
Yes.
Yeah. I would arguably, as I'm learning more, it seems like the most dangerous type.
Yes.
Like the white moderate evangelical pastor, to me, is the most dangerous type because it soft washes, it whitewashes what you should be taking a stand on, as opposed to both sides. Whenever I hear both sides, I lose it. Whenever I hear a pastor or anyone in my DM sometimes, hey, Tim, I love your stuff, man, but hey, both sides, the extreme right and extreme left. I'm like, what? I need receipts of the so-called extreme left. Like, who are they? Where are they? Who's funding them? Yeah, who's funding them? And what are they advocating for? Affordable health care for everyone?
That's
what prison reform? And that both sides think it's such a trap. Because, Jamar Tisby, going back to him, he has a shirt that I have the hoodie. I brought it with me. It says, justice takes sides.
Yes.
And yes, is God on the side of the oppressed or not in the scriptures? Frankly, the Exodus story, when God drowns the empire, I'm like, even God, for me, that's a little violent. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but it's the story. But I'm like, there's a side that God takes in that story of who he's liberating. And it bugs me. I'm curious to hear, because you and I, we lived in and we grew up in two different worlds, right? In every way. I think, but I grew up in New Jersey. I don't think you grew up in New Jersey.
No.
Yeah, okay.
I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio.
All right, well, there you go. And then white church guy, all this stuff. I mean, I'm sure you hear that too. Hey, both sides. When you hear this stuff, especially from white Christians, what do you think about that? Because it drives me crazy. It's got to drive you even madder because you know where that comes from, and the tradition that you're a part of. That's we've been having these discussions for decades now,
right? And
where's the inroad? Where's the progress?
Yeah, there's only the side of moral courage. There's only the side of moral imagination. There's only the side of love plus justice.
Yeah,
not love and not just justice. I think those two have to flow together.
Yeah.
Love without justice is just sentimentality. And justice without love can become legalism and brutality.
Yeah.
But when they're together, they always get married at the altar and they have these twins, one called liberation, the other called transformation. And that's what we are called to. We are called to take sides I mean, it's weird to me. It's very weird to me that the American Christian tradition, the one form of the evangelical tradition, follows a person who was executed by the state, follows a person who took sides for the poor,
Right.
follows a person who undercut patriarchy, follows a person, guess what? Healthcare for all. Yeah. Right? You need to be healed?
Right.
We'll hook you up.
Right, no deductible.
That's right. There's no deductible on this thing,
Come on.
And so it's strange that there is a fear, because it goes back to the empire piece, that American Christianity is essentially capitalism in ecclesiastical garments. And so we wear the Jesus shirt, but we have a capitalist heart, because we're thinking about profit, we're thinking about empire, we're thinking about control, we're thinking about hierarchy, instead of, again, interrogation, instead of deconstructing and saying, raising the question. I mean, it was a beautiful, wristlet that we used to wear. What would Jesus do?
Yeah.
It's a great question, but it's a question that we rarely interrogate.
I completely agree. Okay, so obviously the reason why I flew out here to talk to you is because I texted you. I said, hey, this is a crazy scenario where we are looking at the inauguration of Donald Trump that falls on MLK Day. And if there was ever an imagery if there was ever a moment that I think shows that dichotomy, the juxtaposition of what MLK stand for and what Trump represents, it's today. It's the inauguration. And, listen, I part of my world, this, is tracking Christian nationalism and understanding the data on that. And Robbie Jones over at PRRI does a lot of studies on this. It's very clear, not just white evangelicals, but white Christians, period. I mean, Protestant, Catholic, evangelical, all of them mostly in the tank for Trump, every time. In particular, white evangelicalism, 83%, and you look at the data of how black men, black women voted. It's a polar opposite, right? I mean, black women, I think, were 92% for Harris. Yep. I mean, they did their job, right? They showed up, and I'm looking at this and I'm like, again, that myth I was told. Well, no, guys, we solved racism back in the day. I'm like, man, I almost, and I don't want to sound extreme, and I love your thoughts on this. It almost seems like in some ways we're kind of back to where we started in some ways. When I look at Trump and what he represents and who he emboldened, I mean, I go to these events. I hear what the people on the ground say and the things that they're advocating for. It's just so clear to me that these people embrace whiteness. You've heard, I'm sure, a lot of rhetoric around DEI initiatives being so bad and terrible. Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA, said, I'd be more concerned if a black pilot was flying my plane. Right. Literally. And this guy has pastors around him saying, Charlie's doing great work. Trump is doing great work. And there's Charlie. God has given us a calling to make America great again. I mean, I want you to preach at me. What do you? I know you see this stuff too. Yes. And you see it. You see what's happening on Inauguration Day. How do you read this? What are your thoughts on this scenario that we find ourselves in 2025?
I would say this, that America has always been in a struggle. There are several moments in American history where the empire was almost overthrown. One was what was known as the Bacon Rebellion in Virginia, where indentured servants, many of them from Europe, joined with indentured Africans and enslaved Africans and said, the problem is the person who owns that plantation. And as a result, Virginia began to write laws to give privilege to indentured whites, that we're not going to give you more money, but I will say that your whiteness will allow you a privilege over this person who is black. And that began the introduction of the whiteness as an ideology that began to undercut the idea of democracy. Another moment was the post-Reconstruction period, now the Reconstruction period in America.
Yeah.
So here you have, after the Civil War, one of the most incredible things happens in the United States that we don't examine enough, and unfortunately, because people are against history and all of that, you had formerly enslaved Africans who were able to amass extraordinary amounts of land, wealth, build schools. I attended one of those schools, Morehouse College. They became senators before there was a Barack Obama and a Raphael Warnock.
Yep.
There was a Senator Hiram Revels. These people from Mississippi, Louisiana, were writing laws, and a congressman, one of my favorite, I think he is the greatest congressperson ever, is a person by the name of Robert Smalls. And everybody should know this person's story, who was born in Beaufort, South Carolina, an enslaved African. And he married as an enslaved person, and he had a child. And he'd already had two older daughters, but this child that was born, who was going to be Robert Jr., he did not want that child to grow up in a system that did not see him as a human being. So he did something that was absolutely extraordinary to him. He plots to literally steal a Confederate warship and succeeds.
Oh my gosh.
So the racism is ignorant and arrogant at the same time. So it assumed that people of African descent did not have the necessary intelligence to, quote unquote, be a captain of a ship. But people of African descent were the ones who built the ship, cleaned the ship, drive the ship, do everything, but you can't be captain.
Yeah, right.
So Robert Smalls and 11 other Africans, along with his wife, they come up with this idea. They say that we notice that the ones who think that they're captain in the XO, every night they get drunk and go off to the red light district. So what we're going to do is, one of those nights, we're going to bring our family on board late at night, and we're going to sail this ship out of the Charleston Harbor. And they put Robert Smalls in a Confederate outfit and put him on the bow of the ship. And only the moonlight is giving a silhouette. And now, Smalls had been cleaning the ship, working the ship, fixing the ship, essentially navigating the ship.
Right.
And so he memorizes all of the Confederate war signals to get out of the harbor and beyond.
Get out of here.
Just in his head.
Right.
So as they're sailing out, you have to go to the harbor master. The harbor master has to give you a code, and you have to flash back the right code or you get shot.
Right.
He flashes the code. Wow. They let him out. But that's not where the story ends. There's a blockade because the Civil War had already started, because there was all those shots that were at Sumter already. And they're out into the harbor, and now moving out farther out upon the sea. And the Union forces had a standing order to destroy any Confederate ship. So they're moving out. This ship is called the Planter.
Okay.
They're moving out there. And one of these Union ships sees the Planter. And they train their guns to take down the ship. And Robert Smalls and his crew are like, what are we going to do?
Right.
Well, Sister Smalls says, find me a white sheet. They find a white sheet, run it up the flagpole, but here's the crazy thing. A fog comes in. They can't see it. And so literally, according to the one particular writer, they are counting down to destroy the ship. Ready, aim,
it's like a movie.
And before they say fire, the sun comes out and burns off the fog, and they see the flag. And they say, hold up, ceasefire.
Right.
And they board the ship, and they're looking for Confederate soldiers. Robert Smalls, I think his wife has the child and raised the child up, and says, I give this ship to Abraham Lincoln for the fight for freedom. Now, I wasn't on the ship, but I could imagine the soldiers' mouths are on the floor. Because they're like, it's destroying every myth that they've ever had.
Right.
So Smalls, that's not where the story ends. Smalls, they moved to Philadelphia.
Now we're talking.
He moves to Philly.
They get a cheesesteak.
Yeah. He might have. That's great. He gets a cheesesteak. They move to Philadelphia, but he then joins the Union Army. He becomes the first African-American officer in the history of the United States. Still not enough. He moves back to Philadelphia and sends his daughters off to Europe to study because he believed that men and women should be educated. But then he and his wife decide to move back to South Carolina where they were enslaved. But here's the crazy thing, Tim. They buy the plantation where they were enslaved.
Get out of here. This isn't a movie yet?
This is not a movie
You
yet.
just told me a movie script, bro.
This is real history.
Wow.
They allow the mistress
Powerful.
to live on the property, not in the big house. She had a little house at the back, like Airbnb, I guess.
Yeah.
And so they start 4 schools for formerly enslaved people. But that wasn't enough for him. He then becomes one of the wealthiest men in the history of South Carolina and runs for Congress and wins. Here is the most powerful piece. He introduces legislation that becomes the public school system of America.
Get out of here.
Yes. So what I'm saying is, in the Reconstruction moment, what happened 30, 50, 15 years after the enslavement period was one of the fastest advances of any people in history moving from a statement of not being human to literally moving in a trajectory of liberation and transformation until someone new comes to power. The former plantation owners wanted their stuff back. Now, here's the crazy thing. Part of the campaign in the post-Reconstruction era was, we want to take our country back. And so there was a compromise, what they call a secret compromise, I think the compromise of 1877, where Andrew Jackson then allows former plantation owners to have their land back simply by pulling federal troops. And that we enter into the era of what we know as lynching and Jim Crow becomes the policy in the United States until roughly about 1965. Peonage becomes the policy in the South, where 500,000 people, black people, were re-enslaved up until 1972.
Oh my God.
The re-enslavement was, we call it peonage, or better yet, we call it incarceration. So this is what was happening. Laws were on the books in the South to say that if I was walking down the street and it was me, you, and a couple of friends, I had to have papers. If I didn't have my papers, I would be placed in jail. Then I would be told that by the judge, you owe X amount of dollars. I don't have $1,000. Well, you have to work your debt off. And my labor was then sold to places like U.S. Steel to rebuild the South. So we have the wealth of the United States was built by this labor off of stolen land.
Yep.
And then you have another portion of wealth that is then built again off of the re-enslavement of 500,000 people who are dealing with debt peonage. The debt peonage system then shifts in the 70s when a person by the name of Richard Nixon becomes president, and we call it the war on drugs.
Yeah.
So America consistently, so when the civil rights period comes in, the civil rights period was disrupting and destroying an economic system that was re-enslaving people, that was keeping people from being fully human, and at the same time was also forcing America to face the idea of, you claim to be Christian, you claim to love Jesus. If you truly claim it, let us interrogate it and live it out. And Dr. King was assassinated as a result of that. The work of Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker and other people were the work of that, of disrupting, again, a system that had been disrupted during the Reconstruction period, that had been disrupted during the abolition period. And that period during the, right after the Civil Rights period, you saw an amazing, again, shift and expanse of people going to college, purchasing land and homes and building businesses, again, until another shift that then puts money in the hands of the descendants of the plantation owners who became the people who owned privatized prisons. Yeah. So it's a continual fight, is my point. And unless we understand the complexity of that history, and that history is not a history that just affects people of African descent, it affects everyone. Yeah. Because the civil rights movement was about the freedom, and that's the beauty of it, the freedom of all. The beautiful thing about when Black people talk about Black Lives Matter, when Black people talk about civil rights or the freedom movement, it always benefits everybody. Yeah. The greatest beneficiary of the freedom movement were white women. The glass ceiling of being able to move into corporate structures was directly connected in many ways, because the majority of the organizers in the freedom movement were women, and those in power felt more comfortable allowing people in their own community to have more movement than other people. So there was always a great benefit from other people. The fact that we have so many brothers and sisters who have migrated and immigrated from different countries is a result of the freedom movement. Right. You know, our Asian brothers, our Muslim brothers and sisters, whatever country Southeast Asian, because of the movement, and because of the movement also connected with what was happening with colonialism in India, and also the anti-colonialism movement in Africa. It was all interconnected. And what was going on in South America, it's all interconnected. And when we have a true vision that sees us at a round table, not at a dining room long table, we can look at each other and see each individual's ethnicity as a unique, beautiful display of God's grace and not of human competition.
One of the biggest things I'm picking up on that I just noticed is that the way you talk is much more inclusive. Like you're thinking about your other neighbors who aren't like you and ways to make room for them, as opposed to a Make America Great Again movement, a MAGA movement that is very much built on an out group and an in group. Right? Who's on the out, and who do we keep demonizing? Your trans neighbors, your Black neighbors, your immigrant neighbors, right? They're the enemies, and we will keep you safe. And the way you talk, what you just said is such an inverse of that, where it's like, no, I actually, and I use this language sometimes too when I'm trying to talk to conservatives. I say, listen, I want my MAGA neighbor to have affordable health care. Right. I want my MAGA neighbors' kids to not go into debt for college and have access to affordable. I care about them too. I don't want them not to live a good life. I want them to have access to affordable wages. That's a very different way of thinking, as opposed to how I grew up, where there was always an enemy, and I had to always be on God's side, and God would one day conquer my enemies. And I think it's one thing to have that in metaphorical land, but when you have a movement of people, and I'm thinking about Christian nationalism at this point, who use language like the left are demons, the left are demonic, and this is real language. This is not a caricature. I mean, the language of demons is very intense. Demons demons don't repent. Demons, there's nothing salvageable about a demon. The whole point is that you destroy a demon. Right. So when you're calling other people that dehumanizing language, how do you not see where it's going to land you at some point, right? And I think that a really big distinction here, because I don't know, it just seems like to me, as I've been learning more and more about the very not monolithic, but oftentimes incomplicated Black tradition, right, the Christian tradition, but also seeing some of the through lines, there's a real focus on the humanization of all. right? And as opposed to some of the spaces I grew up in, which were built on the dehumanization of the other.
Right.
And that's such a different way of thinking about this. And I would argue way more Christ-like, frankly. And so, as I'm looking at what's coming these next few years, it really concerns me more than ever that we have someone in the president office fueled by a right-wing Christian nationalism that really believes that they have a God-given right to take over the nation and to rule from the top down. I mean, there's a whole theology of this. There's a guy named Lance Wallnau. Ever heard of that guy?
No.
Okay. Lance Wallnau is one of the key architects. He's one of the big players in like the Christian nationalist space, broadly speaking. He comes out of what's called the New Apostolic Reformation. This starts in the independent, largely white charismatic movement.
Is this the guy who created the Seven Mountain?
That's where I'm going.
the Seven Mountain guy.
7 Mountain Mandate, okay?
Okay.
Lance
All right.
Wallnau creates this theology called the 7 Mountain Mandate.
Okay.
Long story short, he believes that Christians, mostly Christians like him, obviously,
Right.
the true Christians, have to control the 7 mountains of influence. It's like government, business, the arts, culture, education, family, and there's like one more. And so, and I think education or politics. And so his whole thing is that we've been given a mandate to infiltrate beyond just the church and to take over these spheres to essentially make America godly again is the idea.
Right.
But it's built on an ethic of whiteness and culture war, right? So if you are...
And it's in response to the freedom movement.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's the thing is like, I didn't have eyes for this, right? But as you're talking, as I'm reading Jamar and others, I mean, even Michelle Alexander's the new Jim Crow.
Yes.
You're like, wait a second, this is not a vacuum. Because see, for me, when Trump first came on the scene, I thought it was an aberration. I'm like, oh, guys, we made a little detour. Us white evangelicals, like this is like a blip in the system.
Right.
I didn't realize it was a fruit.
Right.
Of the moral majority, of Jerry Falwell, of the right-wing media movement. Trump is simply the fruit of what was planted in the 70s and 80s.
Yes.
He wasn't a bug, it's a feature. And so when I realized that, I went, oh no, this is much more complicated than I thought. And this is tied to something that goes back to what you're talking about and beyond. I mean, we can even go back to the doctrine of discovery.
Yes.
Right? The idea that we as God's people have a right to colonize lands and take its inhabitants and subdue them or kill them. And my God, when you start seeing that as a white Christian, it's like you got red pilled. It's like not sorry to the audience, not in the manosphere way. Okay, I'm not talking about that. But it's like you're in the Matrix. You took the pill, and you're like, I don't want to curse in your office, but crap. Like crap. Everything I thought was an illusion.
Right.
And it's really jarring when you first wake up that way and you realize what you were taught is not the reality of the situation.
And that's a continual fight. So the Black faith tradition has always recognized, and when I say that, and let me be clear, when I'm talking the Black faith tradition, there are a variety of iterations. There is the personalized iteration, there is the community iteration, there's the liberation iteration, or I like to say there's the Black church tradition, and there are churches with Black people.
Okay, got it.
Two different frameworks. But that is within the particular tradition that of the Black church tradition that's liberative. We saw this, and that was a common conversation. This wasn't unique. We knew that the moral majority, when Jerry Falwell recognized the work of the Black church, he wanted the same power, but not the kind of power that released the kind of human creativity, moral courage, and moral imagination and spiritual depth. He wanted to specifically, how do I keep the empire? And your 7 Mountain guy.
Lance.
Lance here. He's responding to that. So that response was also the same particular response in reference to what you see in reference to unions and how, corporations were attempting to crush unions. That same response is a response in terms of post-Reconstruction. That same response is a response in reference to abolition. That same response is a response in reference to the Trail of Tears. That same response is also the response in reference to the Chinese Exclusion Act. That same response, it's a continual response. Once the idea of whiteness was introduced, I like to say that It's called COVID-16-19. It is a virus that continues to mutate. And it is the response of people of liberation faith to keep inoculating themselves each generation from a virus that mutates every generation.
Yes. Yes.
It keeps mutating.
Yes.
And Trump is the latest mutation who also has developed some ways to be resistant to what we consider to be traditional inoculation. So what is Trump? He's the avatar. He's not the problem. Trump just represents what we have been dealing with. This idea of make America great, take America back, this is not new language. It's language that has always been used. I'll use the story of my grandfather who attempted to vote in Georgia in 1946. We created a little movie called Otis's Dream. My grandfather's Otis Moss Sr. And he was trying to vote against a particular governor, well, a person who was running for governor by the name of Eugene Talmadge. Talmadge said, if you vote for me, I'm not going to use all the language he said, no blankety blank will ever vote in Georgia again. I'm going to make Georgia great again. That language. So my grandfather attempts to, he was never able to vote. He was denied the right, went to 3 different polling places.
This is 1946.
This is 1946. He was a single father raising 5 children and a sharecropper, but and a World War I veteran, I might add, and was denied that particular right to vote. But he specifically wanted to cast his vote against someone who didn't believe in human flourishing, and that being Talmadge. And he passed on this edge, this idea of you have to be an activist and be committed to building a democracy to his children. You know, one being my father, my aunts, my uncles, all of that.
Wow.
And all of them were involved in some form or fashion in that kind of work. But that was 1946. That was 1946. That specific language is used. That was 1946 of putting in place in rural areas, because he was in rural Georgia, to ensure that you would shrink the voting population.
Yep.
That was 1946. And here was one of the questions I used to ask at polling places. One question was, if you had all your paperwork, I guess, they would say, okay, it's great. I mean, they'd call you boy or girl or whatever. And they would say, okay, can you recite a section of the Georgia Constitution? Now, nobody can, but some people came prepared. And they would recite it. And then the polling person would then say, oh, you got that one. They'd usually have a jar of jelly beans. And they said, can you tell me how many jelly beans are in this jar? And no matter what question you give, it's always wrong.
Right.
So they could always say legitimately, you didn't pass the appropriate test to be able to vote. Those are actual questions.
Wow.
Those are actual questions that would happen. So they had all of these laws in place of voter suppression. This is the same thing. Yep. So it's a continual fight.
Yep.
And if you are not familiar with the history and know that it was in Mississippi that deeply people of faith, like Fannie Lou Hamer, goes to church, she sees these SNCC, the Southern Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, organizing people to vote. She says God speaks to her and says that her role is not going to be a pulpit that will be in a church. Pulpit's going to be the nation, specifically Mississippi. And one of the most fascinating stories, trafficking stories, I'm sorry.
I love the stories.
So
keep them coming.
1962, Sunflower County, Fannie Lou Hamer, she doesn't finish the 5th grade. Okay. Also a family friend of my parents. Wow. And she is called, she's like 40, she's called literally to ministry, but her call in ministry, it's not the church, her call to ministry is human flourishing, to live out. How do you live out the idea of serving Christ? And she joins the movement. 1963, she's in Winona, Mississippi, I believe it was. They were helping some people to vote, and they are picked up by the police. And they see Fannie Lou Hamer. They separate the men from the women, take her to jail, one of the cruelest things that they end up doing. They take her to a prison cell, but then they go and find black male prisoners and tell them, if you don't beat and abuse her, we will beat you and abuse. And the police officers wanted to watch this abuse. And the story is that these men had tears saying to her, said, I'm so sorry. They're forcing us to do this. Fannie Lou Hamer says that the Spirit of God moved in such a way that lifted her out of her body. That she said, I never felt a single punch once. And then God put me back in my body. And she said, that's when I knew that there was a light inside of me. And she always saying, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. And she said, it's my role to allow and teach other people to have their light to shine. And she helps to organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party because black people were not allowed to participate anywhere in parties, specifically politically, in Mississippi. And they go to the Democratic National Convention to be seated. And she takes the mic and talks about Mississippi. As she's taking the mic, Lyndon Baines Johnson happens to walk past the television, and he sees this black woman talking about Mississippi, undermining his administration from his perspective. He calls his chief of staff, cusses him out. What is this person doing on get her off? He's like, we can't get her off, it's live. He said, do something. So they call a press conference about nothing to get her off of the air. Wow. But it was too late because another woman saw Fannie Lou Hamer on television that day, Shirley Chisholm. And Shirley Chisholm said, if a woman who didn't finish the 5th grade, who was a sharecropper, can help transform the state of Mississippi, I can run for Congress, I can run for president. Because Shirley Chisholm ends up running and being seated in Congress. All of the women of color who we have from 1970 to today are directly a descendant of a former sharecropper who got on TV.
Wow.
In other words, there could be no Kamala Harris.
Right.
Unless Fannie Lou Hamer, who had been called by the Spirit of God to do this work. It's a continual fight. And until we have a faith tradition that is deeply connected to these ideas of that the Spirit is loose. And that's what I love about Pentecostalism. The essence of Pentecostalism, which is also an African presentation, because you have a gentleman by the name of William Seymour, who is the founder of the Pentecostal movement. Because Pentecostalism says this in essence: oh yeah, we have a lot of doctrine, we believe in all this, but here's the thing: Spirit trumps doctrine. In other words, my doctrine says women can't preach, but if the Spirit says to you, you're called to preach, I still can't argue with you. Even though, so there is this wonderful contradiction that operates when someone tries to structure. What would happen if American Christianity had Spirit trumps doctrine? Literally, Spirit trumps doctrine.
One of the, just speaking completely vulnerable with you and honest with you, is, one of the hardest parts for me, I know for a lot of people who have found our work helpful as we deconstructed, was trying to find faith again. Right? Because I grew up in like this space where I gave everything to like this white evangelical thing. And, there were parts of it that were really healthy for me, right? I found community and real friendships, and like it changed my life. So many of my really good friends I met out of that world today, right? And it gave me a sense of purpose and like, hey, commit to this Jesus thing. And I didn't know that it was white Jesus, but I was still on board, right? I'm like, I'm in. And then you end up like realizing that like, inside the walls are all corroded and it's totally toxic, right? And all these things happen. And then you realize that you're losing your faith or you're trying to renegotiate it, but then you have always new questions because you're discovering biblical criticism for the first time, right? You're discovering scholars who are like, actually, maybe things aren't what you thought about the Bible. And then you're thinking about, well, does the miraculous still happen? Did the virgin birth really still happen? If it didn't, is my whole faith falling apart? All these real questions, is this just my emotions or was it really the Spirit? All these, I would argue, European-centric questions still, like very scientific, right? But they're questions that you just are kind of forced to ask because in my tradition, the apologetics industry is so important, right? Everything hinged on my faith being true, not in a mystical sense, but in an objective fact-based sense. Here's the top 10 reasons the resurrection definitely happened. That way you can know that you believe a true thing, right? So when that all kind of fell apart and I realized that it's kind of shaky ultimately, you're kind of left, again, kind of how you are with whiteness, you're kind of untethered, being like, can I find faith again? And then I start meeting people, and I'm sitting in your office talking to you, and you're telling me the story about I'm sorry, what was her name again? Say it again.
Fanny.
Thank you. I had it in my head backwards. And how the Spirit of God was on her, and I'm like, whatever that is, that's it. I want that is the kind of resolve I want in my life. Where I can feel the Spirit like that moves me to do things that hopefully shape the world in favor of human flourishing for all of my neighbors. I don't know how it works. I don't know how all that's, I don't care. I'm compelled by that. And it's just really powerful to hear you talk about like the very deep tradition of the Black Christian tradition and how, even for MLK, how his faith was the key animator of why he did all that he did, right? And I think for especially us white folks who are trying to find a space to call just something to kind of guide us, we can learn so much, and I would argue need to. One of the first episodes I did this year was with Jamar Tisby, and the question I asked was, or I said, why you should leave your church in 2025. And I was talking to white evangelicals, and me and Jamar got into it, because me and Jamar, and we always go back and forth, I love him. He's a good friend. And I said, Jamar, I want you to be you, man. Like just give it to me straight. So we had the conversation. And eventually I told him, I said, dude, I don't think that white people need to go back to white church.
I would agree with you.
I don't think that's the play. I think that you need to go to spaces that see the world so differently and not take over, not white savior that stuff, but learn. You don't need to be a pastor. You don't got to lead anything.
Right.
You just got to sit and learn.
Yeah.
And just hear from a whole different way, a whole different tradition that might really change you. Because one of my concerns is that if people like me go back to even like white progressive spaces, it's not decolonizing still.
Right.
And we got to decolonize. And you do that by going to spaces that maybe you're not, maybe you kind of stick out like a sore thumb, which brings me to my segue of when I visited your church last year. I got to tell the audience this story because, and this is me, sometimes I just walk into things not thinking about them. So you invite me out to your church last year. And I was like, Shane Claiborne connected us. Yep. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm honored. So, I fly out, I'm thinking, what do I wear? I have no idea. Okay. I'm a casual guy. So I'm embarrassed to say it publicly, but I will confess, I just made some like rookie mistakes. First, I brought a backpack in. I didn't know. I didn't know. And I'm wearing all black. I'm wearing black jeans and a black t-shirt. I just am. And once I walked in, someone's like, you can't have a backpack in here. I'm like, oh my gosh, I am so sorry. So I took my backpack in. And then I'm sitting kind of towards the back, just observing, trying to get into it. And I want to take a picture, and someone's like, you can't take a picture in here. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm just messing up over and over again. And I can tell, I have to imagine you have security here. I just know. I know everyone sees me, right? I'm like, oh, I just want to blend in. And then then some people come to get me and are like, are you Tim Whitaker? I'm like, yeah. Like, the Rev wants you up front. I'm like, okay. So, and I'm 6'4". You're tall like me. So, we already stand out. And now I'm full of tattoos. And, frankly, I'm like the only white dude in the area. And I'm just being paraded through the front. And I'm like, oh my gosh. And then you stand me up. You stand me up and you say very nice things. I was truly no nonsense. I was truly humbled. I was blown away. And also I was like, oh my God, I don't want to stand up. I just want to blend in. So that was my experience here. But honestly, I got to say, I'm sitting there and I'm watching the choir come in and I'm watching like just the energy. I'm just like, I love this. Like this whole thing. And you get up, you start preaching. And I'm like, yes, like where has this Christianity been my whole life? Because frankly, just reading the Beatitudes led me to like think about things the way that you describe them, but with so much more depth. You know, like the way you exegeted some of the scripture you talked about, and the way you delivered it, like even just like the veracity and the energy. I'm like, yes, like this is what I need in my life, more of that, because I don't want to lose my faith. I still claim radical allegiance to the way of Jesus. Like that is key to who I am. Right. And I don't want to lose that. And all of my metaphysical questions about did or didn't happen, they're not nearly as important to me anymore as am I loving my neighbor well?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And just to, and I'm out of my depth here, but just to maybe bring a little bit of James Cone, a little bit. Okay. I've read 1 or 2 books. Okay. But like to bring in that, the idea of like, if I really care about being in solidarity with the oppressed, am I willing to taste the sting of oppression?
Right. Right.
And I'm like, that to me, that's the call of Christ. I mean, that's what Jesus literally is doing, right? He is a minority under the boot of empire. And like, for me to love my neighbor, am I willing to be in solidarity to the point where I'm willing to taste that same sting of oppression, right? And to me, I think that is the most compelling version of Christianity. That is like, I think just my next trajectory that I'm so enthralled by, but also want to commit to, because to me, it's the only way to live.
And it's so deeply present. I appreciate you. I'm just cracking up your story, man. And so I gave you some of the background about why people were freaking out for those who are watching. So when President Obama was running, we had just a slew of people who showed up to disrupt worship, who were sending death threats, and we had bomb sniffing. So when you come in with a backpack, they're looking at you like, "Oh, you can't bring who are you? You know, Mister from where? Where are you?
New Jersey?
Yeah, who are you?
Sus.
So there's always an eye in reference to that.
Yeah.
And then you're taking a picture. Again, what happened during that time period during the election was we used to have an altar call in the middle of service where people would come and they would kneel at the altar. There was somebody who was recording people trying to get negative statements about Obama in service. And so we just had to put some things in place.
Totally.
It was really, really, really weird. Also very funny. So we had the crazy guy from Kansas City. He's always running around, cussing people out. The pastor, I forgot his name. I think I forget it on purpose.
Yeah, good. We'll keep it that way.
And so they show up one day outside of service, just horrific signs about President Obama, about Dr. Jeremiah Wright, about the church, about just about everybody. And they're standing outside, and somebody runs and says, these people from Kansas City are here, and they're saying some horrific things. And so the choir was about to march in. And so I stopped the choir and I explained, I said, look, we got a crew out here trying to disrupt. I need your help right now. So you're not going to march in. You're going to march outside and you're going to surround every person who has a bullhorn and you're going to sing heaven down around them. So what they say cannot be heard. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen in my life, to have some elders sitting around, some big guy from Kansas City, some super conservative. And before they sing, they asked him to pray. He said, you want to pray with us? No, I don't need to pray with you. That's fine. This little light of mine. And they fall out into the street and they get in their cars and they go away. And the choir comes in and just the church just explodes, because it was the power, it was sonic sacred power. That was happening at that moment.
Really? Can I ask you a quick question about that? Sorry to interrupt you. Just going back to when President Obama was running and was here, right-wing media picked up Dr. Reverend Wright's sermon.
Now, I was pastor But
Okay.
Dr. Wright had retired.
Okay.
So they framed it, Dr. Wright, I'm pastor. So I'm trying to.
Okay, so you're pastoring.
I'm trying to negotiate all of that. Dr. Wright had retired.
I had no idea.
Yeah,
all
yeah,
I
most
knew was
people-
that was Obama's pastor. That was
It
the whole
was,
rhetoric.
when he grew, well, he developed here. He was a very young man in the 90s. I wasn't here in the 90s and all that. And that was his pastor. And then Dr. Wright retires. I come in. President Obama runs. I'm literally, it was like I had been pastor here for a few months.
Oh my God, a few months?
I'm working out at Bally's on a treadmill, and someone taps me on the shoulder and says, "Is that your church on TV?" And there I see Sean Hannity going off. And I said, I have to go.
I grew up on talk radio, so I remember all that. Oh yeah, every day.
That was my introduction. That was my introduction to the church in many ways in terms of pastoring. That was my time to, when I was here to become pastor. That's how I started at the church. Was through that mess. Learned more. I would never wish it upon my worst enemy. It was an interesting time period. But what you were raising about not losing your faith.
Yeah.
There are those who have enforced destination doctrine over journey faith. And the beauty of journey faith is it's not the destination, it's the journey that is beautiful in terms of what you learn and how you grow and how you develop. Howard Thurman, one of the mentors, teachers of Dr. King, he says it this way in a beautiful way. He said, every person has to work through their life's working paper. What is your life's working paper? And he says that the journey of faith, that every person will be upon a sea. And on that sea is an island. And when you get to that island, you will find an altar. In front of that altar is an angel with a flaming sword. Until you place the authenticity of yourself on that altar, you will never truly connect with God until you get past the sea, you get on the island, you get to the altar, and you're willing to place your authenticity upon that altar. And when you do, there is a moment where you will connect with that which cannot be fully described with the human vocabulary. And it will nurture and whisper to you for the rest of your life. But you've got to go across the sea.
Yeah.
It's a journey. It's not destination doctrine. Yeah. And when that happens, you will have, and as a musician, a drummer, you will develop not a faith of symphony with a conductor, but you will develop a jazz faith.
I love that.
And the beauty of jazz is all of these instruments that are not supposed to play together make a decision to play together.
Yeah.
So the saxophone is designed for the marching band. The bass is to be played with a bow, not your fingers. The piano is considered to be European or French classical music, and the drum is not to be played with polyrhythmic sounds, but just 1 and 2. But the powerful thing about jazz, and that's why there's a spiritual nature to it that comes out of the African and African-American tradition, is that each instrument has the right to solo. Each instrument can bring their unique cultural and ethnic perspective to the table. You don't have a piano demanding the saxophone sound like me. The saxophone doesn't tell the bass to sound like me. So the Greek Italian, along with the African Cameroonian Spanish person over here, sitting next to our Southeastern Asian sister, next to a person who is indigenous, we bring some music to the table that the empire doesn't want to hear. Because the sonic resonance of when you and I get together and other people get together, we have a sonic resonance that will tear foundations and rip the pillars of the empire apart. And that's why in the freedom movement, in the abolition movement, during Reconstruction, there was always a song to remind us, a song to speak to us, a song that reminds that we are part of a larger work and allows us to get in touch with an ancient faith, not thinking that we have to create a new faith,
Right.
but an ancient faith. And that's the problem. America doesn't want to be a part of the ancient faith.
Yeah.
It really wants to rework it and rewrite it as a contemporary piece and make a claim that it's ancient.
Right. As we kind of wrap up, and I really appreciate you making the time, I'm thinking about, so what is the song for the next 4 years for us? Right. I think a lot about how, almost, a little over 4 years ago, we had a really violent insurrection attempt, right? We saw all kinds of violence. I know that, MLK preached on violence for sure, and I want to embody the loving your enemies as best as I can, but I know that's different for different kinds of people, like it's easy for me to say that when a lot of the rhetoric isn't aimed at me, right? And I think about, I'll tell you one of my stories that has really impacted me actually was recent. I was at the DNC this past, in August. I was able to go for every night. And it was, quite the experience for a lot of reasons, but it was, just crazy to be there. I'm like, wow, I'm here. And we're in line to get into the United Center. And there's a Trump there's a guy wearing like a Make America Great Again hat. He's doing some kind of content. He's not making a scene. He's doing some kind of content while he's in line, probably a YouTuber or something. And another protester who's protesting the event, the DNC, for not being left wing enough, right? Like one of the, a real, maybe we could say leftist, white, young, comes over to that person who has the MAGA hat on, and they kind of get into it, and that the protester, not the MAGA guy, ends up spitting on like the feet of the MAGA guy. Wow. Now I'm watching this and I'm just like, okay. And there are two older black women behind me. They got their Sunday church hats on. You know what I'm saying? And they you could just, I to this day, don't even know their names. I can barely remember their faces, but there was like a sweetness about them, right? And they saw the whole thing. And I'm eavesdropping on their conversation. And they go, that's not what we do, honey, because we know what it's like to be spit on. And when I tell you that, like, I really almost broke down in the line, just hearing that. And I was like, even now telling the story, just like, it gives me chills, because it was a moment where I'm like, that person who spit on that MAGA guy, in like theory land, I get it. But like, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't solve anything. It's dehumanizing. And once we start dehumanizing those who dehumanize us, we're heading down a really bad cycle. And to hear those two women say, because we know what it's like to be dehumanized, we will not dehumanize even our most vitriolic opponents. Right. Really, like, it just stuck with me, And at the same time, I also realized, kind of again what James Cone says in Black Theology and Black Power, where he's like, why is it only considered violence when the people throwing the boot off the neck are throwing the boot off, but the empire uses it? It's just kind of how it goes. And so, I try and like think about these things, because I don't want to be the white guy who's like, listen, hey, you over there, you can't do that. But at the same time, like, well, the call of Jesus is radical. And so I'm wondering if, maybe a final question here as we kind of wrap up. Over the next like 4 or 5 years, we're going to see a lot of emboldened hate, more than ever, I think. And also, I think we're going to see, moments where like violence is going to happen. How do we navigate that as Jesus people? Maybe what does the Black tradition have to say about violence, and how we navigate this as Christ followers, but also maybe as people who understand and have that legacy of knowing what the empire does, right? And how sometimes, even in the face of that, peace doesn't always work on the surface anyway. Would love your thoughts on that.
That's a wonderful question. I think it's Frantz Fanon and Wretched of the Earth that question in reference to concerning violence and how that works, along with Stephen Biko and even Angela Davis, in terms of talking about how we look at throwing the boot off as a method of survival and flourishing versus dehumanization.
Right.
And I think that keeping those things in mind is incredibly important. But I think one of the key phrases that we must do, and you said it earlier, when we define the enemy as a demon, now, all human beings can do demonic things.
Totally. Yes.
But when we define a person as demon, then we no longer have empathy, dialogue, nor are they neighbor. I like the way that Dr. Samuel Proctor said it. He said, I don't have enemies. I have a whole lot of confused friends. And he says that I have to do that because otherwise I will develop the disease of my enemy. And I love the way that Dr. J. Alfred Smith taught me this. He was in Oakland, California. He's now the pastor emeritus of the Allen Temple Baptist Church, which also is, anybody out in Oakland, it is a tremendous church, liberation centered for years. He's now retired, and they have an incredible preacher and servant who's serving there now. And he said, in a message, he talked about don't die with the disease of your enemy. And he tells a story of a person, I believe it was during, I'm not sure what area, it was a war story essentially, but I'm not sure what community, what nation, where the enemy was imprisoned. And this person was going to humiliate this person who had harmed his family. And would spend so much time in the prison to humiliate and make sure that the person didn't eat and just all kinds of horrific things. And then the prisoner finally died, died of a particular disease. And the person was happy. Good, the enemy's gone. And then they took this individual and said, well, we're going to have to put you in isolation. I said, why? He said, you spent so much time with him that there's a good chance you may have contracted the same disease. And come to find out the person had contracted the disease because he was literally going to die with the disease of his enemy because he wanted to take on that methodology.
Yeah.
Now, that does not mean we don't fight for justice. That does not mean we do not push the boot off. That does not mean, but it does mean that we have to have a moral framework, but the moral framework is never defined by the empire.
Yes.
That's the key. Darth Vader doesn't tell the Jedi how I'm going to use my lightsaber or what color it's going to be.
Right.
I'm going to use it the way that I want to use it.
Right.
And so we have to be careful about the empire telling the community how you are to function. And we are in that mode where you have an empire saying, you can't do this, whether it's BLM or whatever, you can't do that. You rioters. Right. That's a fascinating thing. It's like, you rioters, what are you talking about? The rioters. But then when the real rioters show up, then all of a sudden there is a shift.
Yeah.
When we want to overturn a government, there's a shift.
Right.
So we don't want to
protesters.
Yeah, they're protesters now. They were just taking pictures.
Right.
With their androids. I guess,
right. Yeah. Exactly. And their bats.
Yeah, and their bats. Yes. Do not die with the disease of your enemy. This is a long fight. I love the way that my father said it in such a beautiful way. Some younger people called him and said, Dr. Moss, we're really struggling with what's going on. And he said in his wonderful, my father has this great deep voice, and has this slow cadence. He just said, we've been here before. This is not a finished journey, but an ongoing journey. And your responsibility is to do good during the time that you are given and to pass it on. And if you do good with the time and the gifts you are given, and you make the decision to pass it on, 7 generations from now will be a generation that will say thank you. We place a brick upon the cathedral of liberation. We don't build the entire cathedral. Our role, Otis's role, Tim's role, just a brick.
Yeah.
And the next generation adds another. And 7 generations from now, there might be a cathedral, unfinished, but a cathedral nonetheless.
Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, what a pleasure to talk to you in
your
your office. We have a lot of work to do.
Yes, sir.
And we're in it all the way with you. So thank you for your time.
Man, thank you, bro.
Dude, that was awesome. So good.
Man, this is great, man.
Dude,
This is
we
great
crushed
talking with
it.
you.
That was awesome. Dude, that was so good, man.
Man, it was a pleasure talking with you, brother.
I love it. It was so good. That was great.
Oh, man.
That was great.
Fun.
Oh, yeah. I know. I mean, oh my God, I'm thinking, I'm just like, we gotta go. No, that was awesome. Let's do it. We're still rolling. Yeah,
we're rolling. Hey, this is Otis Moss. I'm with my man Tim right here. I want to share a couple of things. If you haven't checked them out, please check them out. Everybody should have. You should have in your library. You should have Jesus and the Disinherited.
Yes.
By Howard Thurman. It's super small. I'm telling you, it will bless you. Also, there's a great book, Black Liturgies, by Cole Arthur Riley. If you like poetry and prayers and letters, it will also bless you in a major way. And this season, dealing with Dr. King, reread the letter from Birmingham jail, but check out a wonderful collection titled The Radical King. You will get a completely different perspective of Dr. King, reading the speeches that are never read when politicians show up to say, hey, wasn't he a great person? I tell you, it will truly bless you. And the final piece is there are several amazing books on Fannie Lou Hamer. Anything that you pick up on Fannie Lou Hamer, I tell you, will blow your mind and literally change the way that you see the faith tradition, that we are called specifically to live our faith, not legislate our faith, not force anyone to have our position, but just live it in such a way that you let your light shine.